Life in the oceans of the Paleozoic was flourishing and increasing with great diversity. At this time, life from these oceans began to inhabit the barren expanses of dry land for the first time. Prior to this, life had been restricted to marine and aquatic environments for some 3 billion years. Within inhabiting dry land came great challenges to overcome. Today we will explore these early land ecosystems. The first terrestrial organisms were plants and fungi. The earliest evidence for these organisms is found in strata from the Ordovician period, in the form of fossilized spores. Although the earliest evidence for the colonization of land is found in this period, these organisms may have started inhabiting terrestrial environments as far back as the Cambrian period. Early land plants were small, and would have been similar to today's hornworts, a group of primitive plants, and setophytes, a group comprised of mosses and liverworts. Early fungi were similar to modern arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. These types of fungi form symbiotic relationships with plants, which could have possibly aided early land plants in inhabiting terrestrial environments. Vascular land plants underwent a significant radiation starting in the Silurian and continuing into the Devonian. During this period, animals would migrate out onto land for the very first time, through rivers and other freshwater habitats. The first of these animals were several different arthropod groups, such as myriapods, hexapods, and arachnids. The possible reasons why these animals migrated to terrestrial areas was to evade oceanic predators, or in search of a food source from the newly growing forests of primitive vascular plants. Prototaxites was a mysterious organism that lived from the Silurian to the end of the Devonian. It was the largest terrestrial organism of its time, growing up to 8 meters or 26 feet tall. When it was discovered, it was thought to be a coniferous tree, though later on through thorough examination it was found to possess microscopic tubular structures, a characteristic of fungi. Because of this it is now thought to be a fungus, though the taxonomical placement of this organism is still debated. Plants during this period would have grown along rivers, in wetlands, and along coasts, as they were more water-dependent than a majority of current-day plants, lacking the adaptations needed to grow in drier areas. Cooksonia is one of the oldest known vascular plants. It lived from the Silurian to the early Devonian. It was a small leafless, rootless, upright plant, with a stalk that branched out dichotomously. It would have reproduced through releasing spores, like most plants at the time of its existence. Though treated as one group due to their similarities, the plants in the genus Cooksonia might belong to different groups, possibly making this genus polyphyletic. Rhiniophytes were a paraphyletic group of vascular plants similar to Cooksonia, which could possibly belong to this group. These plants would have grown upright stalks from ground-creeping rhizomes. Lycophytes are vascular plants that first appeared during the Silurian. Unlike most of their contemporaries, they would survive to the present. The earliest lycophytes would have been small herbaceous plants, and possessed a specific type of leaf called a microphyll. These plants would have reproduced through dispersing spores. Zostrophylls were small vascular plants, similar to other plant groups like rhiniophytes. However, they were actually related to lycophytes, despite their similarities to other vascular plants of the time. They branched off from the common ancestors of lycophytes, making them stem lycophytes, explaining these more primitive features. Trimerophytes were a paraphyletic group of vascular plants similar to rhiniophytes and other plants of the time, though instead of branching dichotomously like other plants, they would have done so anisotomously. The ancestor of the euphylophytes, the group that consists of ferns and seed plants, belonged to this group. A possible candidate for the earliest group of terrestrial animals were the euthycarcinoids. They lived during the Cambrian period, millions of years before the first known terrestrial animals. They would have lived in shallow freshwater environments, and there is evidence that they might have laid their eggs in coastal wetlands. Myriapods were some of the first terrestrial animals. They are the first known animals to breathe atmospheric oxygen, and the first known to use chemical defenses. They first appeared during the Silurian, descending from aquatic ancestors. These early myriapods were similar to their extant relatives, possessing long bodies and multiple limbs. They were probably detrivores, feeding on dead, decaying plants. Though these animals are thought to have first appeared in the Silurian, molecular clock analyses could place their origins in the Cambrian period. Arachnids first appeared in the Silurian. These early arachnids would have ranged from small spider-like animals to large scorpion-like forms. These animals were probably some of the main land-dwelling predators of the Silurian and early Devonian. Spider-like arachnids of this time, the trigonotarbids, lacked the ability to produce silk, and therefore couldn't construct a web to catch prey. Instead, they probably would have ambushed them. Eurypterids belonging to the suborders Eurypterina and Styloneurina probably lived among some of these early terrestrial communities, though most of these animals would have only lived in the bodies of water these ecosystems grew alongside, excluding some more amphibious ones like Hibbertopterus. Hexapods appeared sometime in the early Devonian, including some of the earliest insects and springtails. The Middle to Late Devonian was an important time in the history of terrestrial ecosystems. During this period, the first trees would evolve, along with the first ferns and horsetails. This period also saw the arrival of the first vertebrates on land. These vertebrates were sarcopterygians, also known as lobe-finned fish. Tetrapods, a group comprised of modern amphibians, mammals, reptiles, and birds, descended from these fish. Sarcopterygians possess thick, fleshy fins, unlike the actinopterygians, which have thinner, webbed fins. These thicker fins would have aided them in maneuvering on land. Tetrapods, along with lungfish and coelacanths, are the last living members of this once abundant group of animals. The first plants to evolve into trees might have done so to store more water, to absorb more sunlight, or to produce a higher quantity of spores. The earliest known plants to have grown into trees were the Cladoxylopsids, which first appeared in the Middle Devonian. These trees would have had a single tall trunk, and would have been on average around 8 meters or 26 feet tall. They appear to have lacked true leaves, having photosynthetic branches instead, similar to earlier vascular plants. The trunks of these trees were hollow, and the strands of xylem in their trunks were connected to a network of soft tissues, and as these trees grew and expanded, these strands of xylem would tear apart as they were stretched. Although this seems like it would be harmful, these strands would eventually heal and the overall structure of these trees would have been stable. The Cladoxylopsids are thought to have been relatives to ferns and horsetails. Progymnosperms were another group of early trees. These trees were probably the largest organisms by this point in time, with trees in the genus Archaeopteris reaching heights of 20 meters or 65 feet tall, and were the first plant to evolve true wood. These plants might have been ancestral to the spermatophytes, also known as seed plants, though these trees reproduced via spores instead of seeds. They would have had fern-like fronds, and had a similar appearance to conifers. The progymnosperms dominated terrestrial ecosystems by the end of the Devonian, the aforementioned Archaeopteris being one of the most common plants on the planet at the time, forming vast forests. This group of trees would last through the Carboniferous, and then eventually go extinct at the end of the Permian. Ferns and horsetails originated in the Middle Devonian. The ancestors of these plants could possibly be the racophytes. Ferns and horsetails were important components of Devonian land ecosystems, and would continue to be important millions of years in the future. The first seed plants originated in the late Devonian. Unlike later seed-bearing plants, the seeds of these early ones lacked any specialized structure, like cones or flowers, and simply would have grown along the branches of the plant. Seed plants would eventually become the dominant group of plants starting in the Permian. The ancestors of terrestrial vertebrates would have lived in freshwater environments, and probably would have been similar to their relatives in the groups Eotetrapodoformes and Tetrapodomorpha, which would have lived in similar environments. The animals in these two groups were relatively fish-like, and most likely weren't land dwellers, though they probably possessed the ability to survive on land for short amounts of time, similar to the extant lungfish. Elpistostegids, sometimes referred to as fishopods, shared many traits with the tetrapods, however they were still generally more fish-like. This group houses two important transitionary links between the aquatic lifestyle of the lobe-finned fish and the terrestrial lifestyle of the tetrapods. These links are the animals in the genera Panderichthes and Tiktaalik. These two genera of animals lived during the late Devonian. They had flat heads with eyes at the top, similar to crocodiles, lacked dorsal fins, and had bones similar to their tetrapod relatives. Tiktaalik was the more tetrapod-like of the two, possessing a mobile neck and pectoral fin bones allowing for better locomotion on land. These animals lived in shallow waters, and had predatory lifestyles, temporarily moving up to land using their pectoral fins for support to find food, or to evade larger predators. Stegocephalians are the closest relatives to the tetrapods and first appeared in the late Devonian. They had features that would be main characteristics of tetrapods, such as having full limbs that possess digits on their feet. Many of these Devonian stegocephalians still had the traits of fish, ones like Acanthostega retaining these more fish-like traits, like breathing through gills, and spending most of its time in the water. However, there were some that were more adapted to land, like Ichthyostega. Ichthyostega had a robust ribcage, and strong forelimbs that aided it in maneuvering on land. These animals lived similarly to amphibians, and had an overall amphibian-like appearance. These early forests would have formed in swampy and generally wet areas, and would have enjoyed a warm, tropical climate due to a greenhouse phase during the Silurian and Devonian.